Great, thank you very much, Joan, and thank you everyone for taking the time today to review the notes and document management link from Orchid Systems. So as Joan briefly mentioned, with the document management link solution, we're giving you the ability to store documents outside of Sage 300. My example today is in a network folder, but you could also store documents in SharePoint or Google Docs, Google Drive, Dropbox. The idea is that you'll be storing these documents in a folder of some type, and then the document management link solution will provide a link from that folder to a screen in Sage 300, and more specifically a field. So as I mentioned, I have my documents stored in a network folder. So on my C drive, I have a folder that I've called Orchid Documents. And then I've chosen to separate my documents by the type of documents that I'm storing. You would have the ability to design the foldering system however you wanted to be storing your documents. But the initial example I want to show today would be around the AP invoice entry, because that seems to be one of the most popular places that people want to see documents. So I have a folder called AP Documents, and then I have separate folders for each of my vendors because I'm choosing to link to the vendor and store documents based on the vendor. Now, Document Management Link is sophisticated enough that it can create some folders for you. So in this case, if I were to store a document for a new vendor that didn't have a folder, then Document Management Link would be able to create that folder and then store the document within. So our first example is going to be around vendor 1200. So I just want to show you, I just have these two documents currently stored for vendor 1200. So when I go into the AP invoice entry screen, we're linking not just to the screen, but to the actual field. So in our first example today, I've got a link against the vendor number field. And then based on the value within that field, it will display the appropriate documents. So in this case, the first box that we're seeing, this document management link window, the first box that I'm seeing here is around the vendor number 1200. So I'm seeing those two documents that are stored in that vendor's folder. If the value changes in the field, so if we change that value to 1400, I'm then going to see the documents that relate to vendor 1400. And you can configure this to say, I'd like to see these documents on any screen in Sage 300 that field appears on. So you have the ability to store documents once and view those documents against multiple screens. We'll come back to this second box that's empty. The third box is actually a configuration around the purchase order number. So it's based on this purchase order number field appearing on the AP invoice screen. But these documents were probably stored against the purchase order screen. So again, able to store documents once, but see those documents against multiple screens. The bottom box, the GL account, is just an example to show that you can configure around entry grids on a screen. So we've got a configuration here around the GL account. The purple box is the notes product, so we'll come back and cover that. I think I'd like to just stick with Document Management Link initially, and then we'll come back and review the notes product. So this middle box that's empty right now, you have the option to configure against two fields, so you can filter. So the second box here is configured around the vendor number and the document number. So what I'm doing here is I want to be able to isolate the one document that relates to this particular AP invoice entry, so it's easy for me to find that document. So with Document Management Link, oftentimes people think when we talk about documents, a lot of people go to the OCR capture capability where you can feed a piece of paper into a machine it's going to read the fields and populate the information in Sage 300. That's called OCR capture. This product does not have that. There certainly are products out there that integrate with Sage 300 that you could use, but those types of products can get quite expensive because imagine the configuration that it would take to have a piece of paper read and the software to know where that information needs to go in Sage 300. So those solutions will start around $25,000 or $30,000 and can get up into the six figures quite quickly in terms of how much you need in terms of configuration. So Document Management Link, it has a much, much lower price point, but we're assuming that you have the documents in an electronic form. Now, whether they come in electronically or perhaps they're coming in through the mail, nowadays people have scanners on their desk, so it's quite easy to get a document into an electronic form. And so for that much, it doesn't really matter who is creating that electronic document. If you have a mail room or someone responsible for opening the mail, they could be the person that does the scanning. And in that type of scenario, we would typically suggest that you create like a suspense folder where those documents would get scanned into one place so that it's easy for the users that are then at this stage entering a transaction and they want to attach the appropriate backup. What a user needs to do is just click the Add button. So when you hover over the Document Management Link window, the Add button will appear. And when you click that Add button, you're just going to get your standard browse capability. And so if things are in one folder, a suspense type folder, it's quite easy for the users to navigate to. So if you remember, my foldering is down in my C drive. So I'm just going to grab something from, maybe let's go to my documents and we can grab a document here. So let's grab this chat log. So when a user wants to attach a document and store it within the filing system you've created for Document Management Link, they just need to click on that document and drag it and drop it over the Document Management Link window. Now, in my case, I left the original document in place, but if we're talking about this suspense type scenario where you're scanning into one folder and then you want to refile it into the filing system you've created for Document Management Link, all the user would have to do is press the Shift key when they're doing that drag and drop, and it's going to move the document. But the other thing you may have noticed that happened here was my chat log document was renamed, and that is an optional configuration where I've said I want to rename the document based on the value within the document number field. So that's why it changed it, to INV567. So that's an optional configuration. But if we now go back into my C drive, ORCID, documents, AP documents for my vendor 1200, you'll see that document is now stored there, even though I took it from my documents. So it's going to refile it for you. Now, I just stored one document. You could store multiple documents, and you could just go out and grab another document. Now, in the case of, let's just go back to where we were before for my documents, and we'll pull up that same chat log. If I go to store a second document of the same file type, then it's going to ask me if I want to overwrite the document, or I actually do want to store more than one document and I want to just start to put in a -1. So you could do -1, -2, however many documents that may relate to this particular invoice entry. So you can store multiple documents. If I were to go and store a document of a different file type, in this case a document, a Word document, then it will just do the original naming convention. So you have the option to store multiple documents, even if you're changing the name of the document. So I mentioned the purchase order. So this purchase order, for example, you can open up the documents from the document management link window, and it can be any file type. So as long as the user has the home program necessary to open that document, the user would be able to open it straight from the document management link window. But as I mentioned, this original document probably would have been stored around the purchase order screen. So if we go down into the purchase order entry screen and we call up purchase order 1, we'll see the exact same document. Sorry, the chat window for GoToMeeting. You'll see the same document here against the purchase order screen, where I've configured it around the PO number. And you'll notice you can do a configuration even around a system generated field. In this case, the Sage 300 will create the purchase order number for us. So all you have to do is save the document so it generates the number, and then you can store a document against it. You'll see here that I've also got a configuration around the item number, and that's around this item number here in the entry grid. So you can configure document management link for any field on any screen of Sage 300, as well as any third-party products that are what we call written in the SDK. And the way you would know that, one thing would be you would see the module appear within your menu of modules within Sage 300. But we've also given you a tool. So if I open up the order entry screen just as an example, when you install Document Management Link, a tray icon is going to appear in your start menu. And you can go to the options for that tray icon, and you can click on any field on a screen, and it's going to show you what the Roto ID is. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the Roto ID, that's a screen number. Every screen in Sage 300 has a screen number that we call a Roto ID. And so any third-party product that is written in the SDK would also have a Roto ID. And then the correct field name that you want to configure against. So if you can go into any third-party module and you can get those two pieces of information, then you would be able to use Document Management Link for those products as well. So the only limitations that you have, I mentioned you can configure around any field on any screen in any module. The only limitations that you would have would be a drop-down list, something that looks like this, or a checkbox. So when you see a checkbox like this, those are the only limitations in terms of what you can configure against. So all of this installs under what we call Information Manager. And under the setup options is where you would configure Document Management Link. So if we have a look at that vendor number, document number as an example, and we go into the details, you'll see it's quite simple to configure. My configuration is stored in a network folder. But as I mentioned, you could store in SharePoint or Google Docs or Dropbox. And then you would specify the field label that you want to configure against. So our first field label that we were configuring against was the vendor number field. And then the second field label is the document number. And then the path to the folder that you're storing the documents. So mine was in my C drive, ORCID, documents, AP documents. And then I mentioned earlier that Document Management Link can create some file folders for us. And the way it's doing that is I'm putting in value in part of the path, and the value is the vendor number. So that's how it knows to create a folder and how to name that folder. I'm telling it to name the folder based on the value, which is my vendor number. And then when we renamed the file, I'm saying use value 2, and value 2 was our document number. And then .ext is saying just leave the file type. So whatever the file type is for that document, don't change it. Just leave that file type when you're storing it. So once you get your foldering system in place, then it's quite easy for you to do the configuration. Now, I, of course, have a number of lines of configuration here. We just had a look at the purchase order number. But something I do want to point out, another reason that we've given you that tool where you can click in a field to identify the correct field name is some of the fields in Sage 300 have more than one name. You know, something like vendor number is a good example. On some screens, it's going to be vendor number written in full. And on other screens, it's going to be vendor NO period. So you would do 2 lines of configuration if you want to be able to see the documents against those screens that have that field label. So for example, if we go back up to accounts payable, the vendor activity screen, you can see the vendor NO period is the name of that field. But if we open it up and we call up our vendor 1200, we're going to see all of those documents that are stored against vendor 1200. So that is the document management link. So let's go back and we'll review the notes product. So you noticed the purple box on the original screen. So this is the notes product. So similar to the document management link, with the ORCID notes product, you can store a note, a free-form note, against any field in any module of Sage 300 and any third-party product that is written in the SDK. So it's very similar to what I just described for document management link. Your only limitations here, again, would be the drop-down list or a checkbox. Other than that, you can store a note around any field. This particular note is stored around my remit to location. So if I were to change that remit to location, you'll see that note disappears because there's no note that's stored around the PO box. And you notice when I go into the Finder, you'll also see information when you go into the Finder. So if there's a note related to something that's appearing in a Finder, you'll see that information in the Finder as well. Now, the reason it's pink, you do have an option to color code the notes. So it's very easy for users to identify which notes relate to them and which ones they can perhaps ignore, simply based on the color. So there's a little bit more configuration to the notes. So under the Information Manager setup, you can set up note types. So this is where you can specify different types of notes. So I have, you know, notes for my admin people, notes for accounts payable, notes for that relate to a credit limit and AR, and shipping notes. So you can have as many different types of notes as you need. And then under the roles, you can specify by note type whether each role can add a note, view a note, edit a note, or delete a note. So for example, the admin department, we're allowing them to view all notes, but they can only add admin and shipping notes. They can only edit admin notes, and they don't have the, or they have the ability, sorry, to delete any type of note. But if you go into, say, accounts payable, you can see that AP can view admin and shipping notes, but they can only edit or delete their AP notes. So you can set up as many roles as you need and specify which note types they can add, view, edit, or delete. And then further to that, you would assign your users. So these are user IDs. So this would, you know, be your employee names, and then you can assign them to a role. So by doing that, you can decide which notes users can add, edit, view, or delete. And then under the options is where you can set up note categories. and you can specify the colors. So this is how you can make it easy for your users to be able to identify which notes they need to review. And then similar to the document management link, you would come to the same screen to configure your notes. So if we open up the details, in the previous screen, we were just looking at network folder. In this case, you would just specify a note, what the field label is that you want to configure that note against, what the note type is, and then the user can open it up. Now, in the case of notes, you have a few extra options as well in terms of the window that appears. For document management link, we opened it up and the window opened and sat there on the screen. If you're just using the notes, you do have options in terms of showing the alert that there's a note on the page. You can change that tray icon that we went into the options. You can change that to red, or you could make it blink. You could also have a note pop up on the screen, but then fade away. Or in the case of with document management link, we chose to show the alert, meaning that window is going to open up and sit on the screen until the user leaves that screen. The other thing that I should mention, you can see that you can create a link to send a user a link to a screen in Sage 300. So if you want somebody to review something, you can just send someone an email clicking the email icon. And if we go back up into the AP invoice, there's one other way for you to know if there's a note on a screen, and that will be up in the top right corner of the Sage 300 window. You'll see this little box, and if it has the squiggly lines in it, it specifies that there's a note that's underlying on that particular screen. And I just mentioned if you click the email icon, it's going to give you a link that takes you to that screen. So you could email this to somebody to say, have a look at this screen. There's something important for you to review. And you also, from the document management link window, you can open up the folders. I went down into my folder icon to show you the path that I took to get to the folder. But from the document management link window, you can just click the folder icon and it's going to take you straight to that folder. And in terms of searching for documents, in my case of network folders, it would just be like a network folder search capability. And in terms of security, network folder security would apply here as well. So you could ultimately limit who would have access to those documents that are stored in the network.